All right, welcome to another one of our SiegeCasts here, put on by the folks at Red Siege. God, I love that intro every freaking time. I get into the music at the beginning, tons of fun. With me today, we have Joe Vest. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through a little bit on what the heck is a Cobalt Strike. So we'll try to give you some material. I mean, literally, this could be a week's worth of training. So we're trying to condense a lot of this into 1 hour. So we'll talk some of the offensive capabilities, some of the ways to detect, defend, ways to use this, and some of the other tools. Real quick intro of myself. I am Tim Medin. I work over here at the Reddest of Sieges. I am the lead author for the SANS Security 560. I also teach the advanced pen testing course, IANS faculty, pen testing forever, all kinds of offensive. With me, I have Joe Vest. So Joe Vest is the technical director. I don't know his title. Joe doesn't know his title either. He is the technical director for Cobalt Strike singular. There isn't only one. There can be only one at Help Systems. Author of Red Team Development and Operations, the original author of the SANS Red Team class, Red Teamer for decades. Joe, say hi to everybody, introduce yourself.
Hey, Tim, thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, so that's a good title right now. I do stuff for Cobalt Strike at Help Systems. That's the best way to put it right now.
Awesome. Good deal. So what we're going to do along the way here is we're going to talk through some of the basics. I'm going to sort of set up the conversation. We'll then throw some of the comments over to Joe. Joe has a ton of experience. He has a very youthful look to him. In fact, we were in doing a gig together in the middle of Idaho. He was the oldest guy at the table by about 5 years. Yep. He got carded. The rest of us didn't. So he's got a lot of tremendous experience here. So he and I were talking yesterday to kind of set some of this up. What is Cobalt Strike? Well, this is used for, Joe put this very succinctly, threat-based security tests. So for red teams, pen tests, blue teams. Joe, if you wouldn't mind, explain this second point, because I think you put this so succinctly, and it's the best way I've heard this spoken.
Yeah, so when I talk about Cobalt Strike, and as we go through this, if you don't know what it is, as Tim explains what it is, it'll make more sense. But at the core, it's a framework. That's really all it is. So I kind of think of Cobalt Strike as something like Photoshop, to where it's in a really, really in-depth tool, but it doesn't do anything for you. So it doesn't create any art. It doesn't build anything for you. But it can be built on, it can be extended, it can be manipulated, so that if you are a professional artist and you learn the tool, you can create really masterpieces of art. And that's the way I look at Cobalt Strike. It is a framework that really, just to be honest, I may not be the best salesperson for Cobalt Strike, but it doesn't really do a lot. Like out of the box, it's just going to sit there and do nothing. It really takes that artist to fine tune it, to understand how to work with it, to tune it to make it do what you need, so that you can perform these threat-based tests, no matter what it is, whether you're doing red teaming, purple teaming, whatever you want to call that. That's really what it is.
Yeah, and I think, I don't want to get too much into the offensive tools debate, because that's a whole rabbit hole we could quite literally spend hours on. But you hear people complaining about this and other tools, and people tend to target this specific tool. Honestly, they're all tools. This one just happens to work well. It's much more robust. The beacons on the systems, they are less likely to crash. So, to some degree, don't hate the player, hate the game. If Cobalt Strike didn't exist in this space, the bad guys would pick something else. So I don't want to get too much into that, but the important piece, I think Joe hit it right on the head. I remember when I first got this, I was like, where's all the other features that I expected in Metasploit? Well, it's not an exploitation tool. You can add those features in. It is a very reliable command and control structure, and that's exactly what it's built for. And it is completely up to the capabilities of the person driving the thing to make art happen. And that's the important piece here, right? And that's, frankly, as much as I want to discuss on sort of the offensive tools debate there. Again, if you've got questions along the way, throw them into the Discord, throw them into the comments. We'll try to address those either along the way or at the end. So I'm going to take over here. Let's talk a little bit about the architecture. So what does this thing look like? Well, there's three primary pieces here with Cobalt Strike. We've got the team server, we've got listeners, and the beacon. So on a compromised host, that's where our beacon runs, our agent, the thing that's taking the actions on the target. That's going to connect back to a listener. So we have a listener, something that's going to receive that connection. Many times we're going to set that up over HTTP, probably HTTPS these days. And the attackers, the offensive folks, are going to be interacting with the team server. This is where we're going to be sending commands to those beacons to take actions on targets in some way, shape, or form. And by the way, we've got links all over the place in the bottom of the slides. The slides are available at redsiege.com/Cobalt Strike if you want to grab those, because trying to retype that sounds very, very painful. So the team server here by default is going to listen on TCP 550. Little OPSEC tip. Don't just have your team server on the internet with 550 open. That's a great way to get caught. In fact, there's a Twitter account, I forget the exact name, where they're sweeping the internet looking for hosts on these specific ports. Bad OPSEC, especially if you're in an operation inside an organization testing their security, whether it be red, purple, pen test, whatever it might be. You kind of want to hide, do a little bit better OPSEC here. Other things you want to do too is, don't use the default certificate out of the box. That said, though, maybe you want to test, can the defenders test some of these and identify some of these really simple things, right? Realistically, better operation is to use a good certificate, use a good domain. We'll talk about some of that in a little while. So our beacon here is going to communicate back in a number of different ways. The built-in listeners, as I mentioned, support HTTP and HTTPS. Realistically, these days, HTTPS is so simple to set up. You could use something as simple as a Let's Encrypt certificate. Of course, you can use a real, if you will, certificate. Also DNS. We'll talk more about DNS here in a little bit. Now, there are other ways that this can connect back, but these are the built-in capabilities. There's other extensions that we can use to have it connect back over things like Dropbox, OneDrive, right? What organization is actually going to block OneDrive from the inside of the organization? Very few. We see a lot of Azure, a lot of Microsoft 365 out on the internet. And of course, we can wrap these into many of the other protocols. We'll talk about some of this a little bit later here as well. Another thing we can do to protect our team server. Now, this isn't built in. So this is a redirector. So it's a way to protect our team server. Think of it like maybe like an octopus. We're protecting the head, if you will, and all the arms and tentacles are going to be out all over the place. So it'll come back into one domain, pivot through that domain back into our main team server. It allows us to some extent, let those tentacles be burned. We can grow new ones, replace that without having to replace the team server. And there's plenty of different ways to do that. We can do that with simple just TCP forwarding. SOCAT, firewall rules, mod rewrite, lots of different options. Feel free to check out the link there. So just want to jump over to Joe real quick. Joe, any questions, comments, thoughts on some of the basic setup and architecture here?
No, you hit on a couple things that I like to point out. Again, back to this as a framework, but you hit on the fact that you can go as, maybe you want to protect your command and control infrastructure, but maybe you don't. So advanced is a relative term. I always look at this. You should tune this for your engagement you're working on. Forget about simple advanced. Come up with your hypothesis of things you want to assess. These could be simple. They could be advanced. And you measure those. So maybe I want to have a default team server. So in the world right now, there's a lot of things that are found. If you look at Intel companies, they find these things all the time. And a lot of those are poor OPSEC. Those tend to not be people with legitimate licenses, because many of the operators who use this properly are following the guidelines that you were mentioning early on. But these are the things you want to do. So typically the go-to I have is your team server is your server. You want to protect that. And that means Cobalt Strike out of its own doesn't really give you that method. This is more of getting into, and we'll talk about this in a minute, your command and control plan is what I call it. Like, how are you going to implement this from an IT perspective into your environment? so that only your operators have access to it, and only the beacons that communicate back can talk to it.
And that's an interesting point too, because that's even like a broad. This is the technical setup, right? Like installing Windows to some degree. There's a much broader question on what are you trying to accomplish with this test, right? Is there a specific adversary or threat level that you're trying to implement? That's way before the technical pieces, and frankly, the most important piece. If you're just firing up these tools and thinking that's it, you've missed a significant and frankly the most important part of the conversation.
Agree. Completely agree.
All right, cool. Let's jump into a little bit on the Malleable C2 here. So one of the really neat features with this tool is it allows us to customize how the command and control actually looks. So it means that it's not super easy, and we'll talk later about some of the defenses and ways to detect some of these tools, but it's not simple, super simple necessarily, to just fingerprint and say, oh, it's always requesting this specific file name. The header always is this. It's always encoded in this method. And because remember here, and we'll hit this point over and over again, Joe and I both will, the point here is to test the defender's capability to respond to a persistent actor, not the tool used by the actor. Now that sounds like the same thing, but it's really not. There are so many actions that are going to be taken on the target, and we want to be able to detect, hey, do we detect lateral movement? Which is a better thing to detect than lateral movement by Cobalt Strike. Because then it becomes lateral movement by literally fill in the blank all of the tools. And if you can have this sort of broader and focused the same way, if you will, focus, that makes things better. So the goal here with the Malleable C2 is that we can start with a theme. So we can make this thing look like WordPress. There's a great one for jQuery so that the requests aren't easily fingerprintable. And of course, we would like the defenders to target in on the actions taken on the target. Very, very flexible framework we've got here. Here's some pieces related to the Malleable C2 profile. We can change the way that the data is embedded, how it's going to be encoded, how the messages are sent back to the client, how that's encoded and decoded, how some of the staging takes place. A lot of great reading on this. Feel free to check out the links there at the end. In fact, Joe's link is the Malleable Explained. It's actually the top link here, Threat Express. That's actually Joe's link where he's got a fantastic markdown related to sort of the process for setting up some of these Malleable C2. Overall, an initial beacon, when it checks in, the connection is going to look something like this. We're going to have the beacon somehow executing on a compromised host or soon to be compromised host, connect back to the server, right? Our team server. This is asynchronous, which means it's going to then check back at a time interval of our choosing. We'll talk about some of the architecture related to different tiers of testing infrastructure, tier 1, tier 2, etc. But it's going to be asynchronous, meaning the agent, the beacon, is going to check in once every 5 seconds, once every minute, 4 hours, once a day, whatever you might set, and say, hey, what should I do? Send the tasking back to the beacon. It performs action, and then if it needs to, sends information back to the server upon next check-in. So this asynchronous is a sort of different model than what we had traditionally with something like Metasploit. There's a lot of different Malleable C2 profiles that are already out here. Now, you'll see this screenshot. We see all these that they're 2 years old, probably a little bit fingerprinted. You can make your own, modify this, customize this in any way, shape, or form. And oftentimes, it's not that you have to make a ton of tweaks, because the defenses these days are still very much signature based, unfortunately. So you can start with some of these, create your own. Joe, in fact, has his own for jQuery profile, because the entire internet runs on jQuery, right? So the sky is the limit here. What we're trying to do is look at web traffic that's normal, and then build a profile off of that normal traffic so that we can blend in. And we're not going to get caught then on the C2. Ideally, we get caught with actions on the target, because that's where the better defense is, or defenses in depth to some degree. Here's an example where we're setting the URI. We can change the URI. What is this requesting on the server, right? In this case, we're looking at the Mayo Clinic. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I really like using medical domains because some organizations don't inspect that traffic. We'll come back to that a little bit later. We can see here that the metadata here is going to be net BIOS encoding. There's different ways we can encode this in an attempt to evade any sort of detection or the defenders themselves. The response, we can customize that as well. You can see here we're just adding some good content here with the HTML and the JavaScript here. And then we're in the middle, we're going to base 64 encode some of our comms. We want to have this thing look as normal as possible. So this is some of our comms, but we can also actually customize even more than that. We can customize how is the beacon going to take actions on the target. So for example, if I'm going to inject into a process using, for example, I can't talk. If we're going to inject into a process, we can specify the various, the allocator that we might want to use. It could be that the various defensive tools, EDR, AV, are fingerprinting specific function calls. And if we can swap that out, maybe we evade detection. There's other things that those defensive tools fingerprint, and if we can change those or tweak those just a little bit, once again, maybe we aren't detected. Ideally, once again, our goal is to test the defender's capability to detect and respond. I would prefer they detect and respond to the actions on the target, lateral movement, things like that, other than the specific tool here, right? Even more post-exploitation, how we do some of the injection, AMC bypasses, all sorts of other fun and interesting things. This is sort of like a whole master class you could go through in itself. Another really neat thing are the various kits. I'm going to do this out of order because I put these in the wrong order. There's a lot of various kits to help modify how the beacon is going to operate. So we can change the different load addresses, some of the offsets, the loading, some of the techniques. 4.4 gives us even more kits. There's the user-defined reflective loader kit. Terrible name. Joe, change that. The sleep mask kit. So it's going to go to sleep and change itself a little bit so that when, maybe a memory sweep to some degree by defensive product looks, it's like, look, that looks like safe code because it's just data and not actually executable. Mimikatz. We've got a bunch of the other kits available here as well. Joe, do you want to jump in and talk some more about these kits, especially some of the newer ones in 4.4?
Yeah. Responding to a couple of questions out there, but so the whole process, again, Cobalt Strike is a framework, and especially as things are moving forward, you mentioned all the Malleable C2 components. That's kind of a part of this framework piece where you can change and plug things in out. Before I talk about the kits, I do want to hit something on the C2 profiles, which is if you found it on the internet, consider it signatured. And there's something, and this gets into a theoretical approach to what you're doing on security testing, which is a little bit beyond what we're talking about Cobalt Strike. But you're looking at, I always look at the tool versus the technique. And again, it depends on what you're trying to measure. I am a fan of trying to measure techniques versus tools, because anytime my tools are caught, I can change that signature is broken and move on. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're looking at your whole detection strategy approach from narrow to wide detections. But the thing is, regardless of that, if you download it from the internet, including what I've put out there for jQuery, assume that it's burned and modify that. And some of these kits, that we'll talk about. There's some people have random ones. There's a handful. I've created a random one. I know that over 40 North, Chris Trencher's created one over there at 40 North, and there's a handful of randomizers to kind of give you a starting point. So that's what I recommend there. As far as the kits go, we have the artifact kit, which is one of the original kits that allows you to change some of the core beacon capabilities on how it actually operates and loads itself. So instead of just checking the boxes for C2 profile, you can actually write your own C code that actually modifies some of the behavior of a beacon. So some people, for instance, have used that to shift to maybe incorporating syscalls into their beacon. So natively, it starts off early in the process to actually run syscalls. Some of the new artifact kits we created, the one that you say is weird, the user-defined reflective loader, or UDRL kit, and it's what it is. It's a user-defined reflective loader. So reflective loading is an important concept. And there's a couple built-in ones within Cobalt Strike. Obviously, these can be signatured or they're very common. So one of the first steps was to say, well, let's take that out and let the user community build their own. So we just say, you roll your own, and then we will take that code and shove it into Beacon. When you create a payload, it gets ripped out and put in place. That concept is what's going forward from now on, even more aggressively. So we have the sleep mask kit. So the way Cobalt Strike sleeps, so the sleep concept is Cobalt Strike goes to sleep, it waits, it wakes itself up, runs a command, goes to sleep. So most of the time it's asleep. During that time, you want it to be obfuscated. There's actually some good topics and stuff on that process right now about encrypting the heap and such. But besides that, there are some obfuscation techniques that are being done now. And we provide a kit to let you change that so that you can do your own. The other piece is, and you popped it up for a second, called Community Kit. This is the one that I'm actually really excited about because Cobalt Strike's a framework. I wanted a way to showcase a lot of the great stuff that the user community is doing. And yes, right here. So the community kit, that's what this is. It is it's a place for us to maintain a list of Cobalt Strike add-ons, for lack of a better word, whether it's an aggressor script, Malleable C2 profiles, beacon object files, whatever it might be. This is a place that the community has been building, because one thing that I'm trying to help drive is more community research and development on these topics, because the community builds things. This allows us to grow and understand our challenges from this industry as a whole. And then we can look at these and say what needs to get rolled back into the core product. So again, making Cobalt Strike a framework and allowing the community to build on it, because to be honest, we will fail if we try to make a product that does everything you want. No one can do that. There's always some need or something, a condition that's there. So the focus is not to have a tool that does all the things, but to have a solid framework that gives you some stability to operate from. So,
yeah, great. Cool. All right, let's jump now a little bit to the next portion here. So talk a little bit about ways that this, and frankly, this is sort of offensive operations in general. What we most of the time want to do is stay in memory, because if I'm only in memory, it's oftentimes, at least so far and traditionally, it's much harder for these defensive products to identify badness, because memory is extremely dynamic. And there's a lot of stuff going on with memory. Whereas if I write to disk, there's the bottleneck of the driver writing to the disk. We can hook that and see, hey, what's being written and in what order. That said, don't be afraid of writing to disk. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes you need to. But just be aware. Most of the time we don't want to. I say that not as a don't ever. I mean, if we want persistence, you're going to have to write to disk, right? So just be aware of that. But most of the time, if we can, we typically want to stay memory only. But again, don't be scared of it if you have to. Just, every time I start writing to disk, I cringe a little bit. Is this going to get me busted? And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. Maybe not quite that high, but whatever. What are some of the things that we can look for some of the in-memory execution? Well, we talked about the reflectively loaded DLLs, right? So we're going to load these DLLs. We send them over into the beacon, load those DLLs, not off of the disk, but straight into memory, call those DLLs, execute. We can hook various functions. That's kind of become the new hotness, hooking, frankly, unhooking as well. PowerShell is great. We'll talk about some of those pieces, other things to look for. We talked about this with the Malleable C2 profile. How do we allocate memory, mark it as executable as we need to? There's multiple ways to do that. We can adjust that with our Malleable C2 profiles as well. Well, not built in, we sometimes want to use a third-party loader, custom loader of some way, shape, or form to launch our code, right? So this could be any number of other things. I could, take Donut to take my shell code to chuck that into memory. I could bounce off other mechanisms. And essentially, that's our stage 0 to get us to our beacon so that we can take actions, right? There's a lot of research in this area because this is the piece where we see a lot of the detections around. So if it's just simply writing this file to disk to get our initial access, whether it be through phishing, some kind of assumed breach, whatever that may be. A lot of research in this area, very, very dynamic area, right? We talked about some of that already with the Malleable C2. I'm not going to go back through that again. There's some Joe talked a second ago about about sleep and how Cobalt Strike actually sleeps. This is an asynchronous tool, meaning we're going to give it a command, it's going to do its thing, and then not do anything for a while, right? And it could be that we have our beacon check in every hour, 8 hours, day. There's no reason for this thing to be sitting out in the open looking like badness if it's not ready to do, I shouldn't say badness. It makes it sound like we're evil. We're good guys. If it's not ready to take an action, right? So what these tools do, and things like SleepKit can help us modify, is it creates a timer and it takes the executable portion of our beacon, marks it as non-executable, and then waits. And then what we have is that when that timer is done, there's just enough code that executed when that timer is done. It says, cool, take that troll that was turned to stone, turn it back into the troll. Let's take our actions. Do we have anything else to do? Cool, back to stone. There's a lot of memory on these systems, and we can't have these defensive products just checking all of the memory. They're very much going to focus on executable memory because, well, that's where the execution is. If any sort of action is going to be taken, it has to be initiated from the executable memory. So if we can minimize that and hide, if you will, it makes it harder for defensive technologies to identify. PowerShell. Now, PowerShell is either your best friend or your worst enemy. There's no middle on this in any way, shape, or form. If you can use PowerShell, you're going to fly all over the organization because PowerShell is installed by Windows by default. That said, there's a lot of logging capabilities these days. There's ways to lock down PowerShell. There's a lot more hooks into PowerShell with things like AMC. That can very quickly get you caught. So if it works, you are absolutely golden. If it doesn't, this is a great way to get caught. It's sort of like the writing to disk, right? I like PowerShell, but I avoid it until we absolutely need this. There's other capabilities too where we don't call PowerShell necessarily directly, where we can use something like PowerPick, Powerline. There's a whole bunch of the other similar sorts of things that call system management automation, DLL, and essentially call PowerShell without PowerShell. Now those pieces are still logged with the PowerShell logging. So just a heads up, PowerShell, best friend or absolutely the worst enemy. What we've seen a bigger switch from is PowerShell moving over to C#. It was the hotness, right? We had PowerShell Empire. Again, it still exists, still being updated. Still can be very useful, but there's a lot more tooling written around PowerShell. what we've seen is a lot of those tools are moving from PowerShell into C#, into .NET. What this allows us to do with it is a capability now in Cobalt Strike to execute assembly. Essentially what this does is it loads a .NET executable that I provide from the team server, from my console, and say, hey, run this thing, loads it straight into memory. We're not going to write it to disk, call the entry point, and execute. This is interesting because now we don't have those same hooks that we have with PowerShell, right? So there's not going to be the same sort of logging. There isn't the same instrumentation here. Very, very useful tool for us as offensive folks. Here's an example where we use arbitrary shellcode. This is using remote inject. This is a custom executable where we can just give it straight away, hey, shellcode, run this sucker, put that into memory, do all sorts of fun and interesting things. Application control, formerly application whitelisting. Application control, this is a great area of research because what this allows me to do is get execution on a system even if the system is configured to say, sorry, you can only run it pre-approved things. What I would like to do from a app control bypass is bounce off of known good executables to transfer files to get execution. What do I mean by known good? Well, frankly, any Microsoft executable, any commonly used software, can I use that to launch shellcode of my choosing, launch my beacon, use that for a persistence where I can bounce off one thing to take an action on the target. Here's an example from the SANS 560 class. And again, this is a very heavily researched area. Here's an example with MS Build. So MS Build is built into Windows, part of the .NET framework, signed by Microsoft, which means everyone's going to allow this. But for the longest time, this was an easy peasy app control bypass because we would bounce off of build to execute our code. Now, what's happening here? What we're doing is we give build this XML file. What these XML files, what it allows us to do is have a very robust build process if we're going to build, some application in some way, shape, or form. In here, we can see here it says hello sec 560. Well, that's not interesting, right? But I could paste in shellcode for Beacon or any other tool of my choosing. One of the really neat things, we talked about Chris Trunzer before. Chris Trunzer figured out that you don't have to put the code necessarily in there. Instead of actually putting in the code like we see to the right, we can say, hey, the code, it's actually over here. And now we give it a web dev link. The cool thing is it's never actually written to disk on the system. It's pulled in across the network, loaded into memory. So from an artifact point of view, it's never actually written to disk. And if I, as the attacker, now take this 11, 22, 33, 44 system, if I take that offline, there is no capability to figure out, hey, what exactly was in this and do some of the reverse engineering here. So I'm going to pull back in Joe here. Joe, what's your thoughts on some of the tradecraft? Any other comments, thoughts, any other ideas here on what we can do for some of that?
So a lot of this, couple of points you made, like one was the stage 0. I'll kind of randomly pick a couple ideas. This is something that I would recommend most teams build. It's not built in Cobalt Strike. There are some loaders, if you will, but you're really looking at loaders that I don't recommend, honestly. Once you start using, I don't recommend to use like your stages loaders, which is the old Metasploit style friendly loader. And I recommend using fully staged payloads, whether it's a binary file like an exe DLL or the raw shellcode, whatever it is. Those getting that started has some characteristics that you may not want to deal with, and you may want to have something beforehand. So a common technique that I would use would have my own stage 0 C2, which really just was executing on a target, making sure this is what I want to do. It's in the safe environment that I feel comfortable. And if everything checked out, it would actually pull down my beacon shellcode and run that. And this is, again, where these are kind of the framework components to where the best uses of Cobalt Strike are to take a really solid testing plan with a good command and control plan, and then layer Cobalt Strike on top. So once you have your whole plan out, you can easily build out, these are the payloads I want. This is what I need. You mentioned Powershell as well. Powershell is really powerful. And you said it can be your best friend or worst enemy. There's ways of making PowerShell work really well if you understand some of the detection caveats, such as the standard IEX download cradle. Those can be changed. You can actually change how PowerShell's working in some of those default functions within Cobalt Strike through the resource kit. Or you can just have your own raw loader and then write your own PowerShell. I've had a lot of work instead of using the IEX downloader, actually drop PowerShell to disk and run it. Because the conditions and the detection assumptions that I had on that environment allowed me to do that. So it really comes down to understanding the environment and knowing where those risks are. And, when you take an action, what is that, the risk reward on doing that? Regardless of that, controlling memory, controlling process execution is really, really important. As defenses rightfully should raise their bar, they're pushing deeper into your hosts, which means deeper into the memory, looking at process trees, looking at relationships, looking at context around that, which is what we want to do. Honestly, ultimately, from a testing perspective, we are trying to raise that bar to make it difficult to perform these actions, not the tools, but these actions that can be categorized as malicious.
Cool. Great. All right. Let's jump into some lateral movement here. Now, I remember when I first started using Cobalt Strike, the piece that surprised me, because before I really started using a proper C2 framework, I spent a lot of time in Metasploit. And as the name suggests, you sort of get used to a lot of exploits. And we used to use a ton of exploits back in the day. Realistically, these days, much harder. We're seeing a lot better defenses on these systems, a much better job of patching. I'm not saying they don't exist, but we've seen that the software itself is now hardened, the OS is hardened, the defensive tools are looking for some of these exploits, the actual execution of that themselves. One of the things that we end up using, as I mentioned, is a lot more of use the access that we're given, right? So I have access, I'm as this specific user. Now, from a tester perspective, the technical things that we like to do are escalate. That's not actually the best thing necessarily. JCon's going to post a link here. Mike Saunders on my team wrote a post called Getting to the Actual Goal. This is a discussion you want up front. Yeah, redsiege.com/goal. Nice and easy link. The important thing to remember here is, what is the goal of what you're doing, right? Well, ultimately, your goal is to make the organization more secure, right? And we're going to sort of walk that back. Part of what we need to do is demonstrate risk in the organization. If I can access, Steve in marketing or Sally in accounting, if I can access their systems and get access to all of the sensitive data, why do I need to necessarily escalate? And I've seen this way too many times. There's going to be a file share, a SharePoint system, something like that with way too many permissions, and there's going to be sensitive data. It doesn't have to be all of the sensitive data, right? An attacker living in a much cheaper cost of living country can live very comfortably for the rest of their life on a meager $500,000 or $1 million, right? I mean, I would like to take a shot at that too, right? They don't need tens of billions of dollars, although they would happily take that. Also, how much would it take? How much of a data loss would it take before your organization ended up in the news? Some type of news that you want to be in. So when we get access to a system, look around, because it could be along the way to getting that domain admin, which is interesting, but still one step away from the important data. If we have access as a low-level user, maybe there's tons of sensitive data there. This kind of goes back to our discussion up front before we get into even architecture. What are the goals of the entire operation? So many times we see credentials laying around, right? what are some of the top ways that we can do lateral movement? Again, assuming we even need to in the first place. We can use the good old PS exec. Nice thing is with that, this is the sysinternals style, signed up by Microsoft. Now this is going to copy a file over, write it to disk. It will execute it at the service. It will leave that service installed by default. We can other built-in capabilities with WinRM or WMI. Lots of other third-party tools like WMI to bounce off MS Build, whatever. Within Cobalt Strike, we have the jump commands to take advantage of a number of these techniques, whether it be WMI, WinRM, or the PS exec. Well, if we're going to use credentials to pivot, how can we get those? I mean, of course, we've got phishing. Tons of opportunity for lost credentials. People use the same credentials at multiple sites. It happened to my aunt. True story. I'm not going to say her name. Last week, I get a Facebook Messenger message from my aunt saying, "Hey, check this link out," which is not how she. It was very unexpected. Turns out she had ended up reusing a password that she used someplace else. Actually, I take it back. That wasn't that case. That was a different one. This was actually a proper phish. It took her credentials and started to propagate, and it went to other family members and friends and family and all sorts of other fun and interesting things. Bad passwords. We try some of the common bad passwords. Season and year is the gift that keeps on giving. By the way, if you're a defender, burn that with fire. Azure has some great ways to get rid of some of those really, really crap passwords. I'm a huge fan of Kerberoasting. Found credentials, you're going to find those throughout. Could be documents on their desktop. Plenty of credentials laying around on file shares in config files, things like that. Joe, what's your comments here on some of the lateral movement we can do just in general and also with Cobalt Strike?
Yeah, so you mentioned the jump command. So I would say sometimes this is argued maybe one of the more limiting areas. Everything has been shifted over to the jump command as a base of a framework. And the techniques that Cobalt Strike uses right now are primarily PowerShell based. And they're just implementations of whether it's WMI or PS exec or some other technique. What I really find interesting about this one is because lateral movement is so unique and there's a lot of options. I mean, you can just do things yourself, remotely run a command through other tools. You can use the native, if someone has PS exec natively installed, just run that. You don't need to use any of the built-in PostEx capabilities. But one thing I had, and I actually was talking to someone this morning who were writing some more add-ons, again, getting it added to CommunityKit for creating a beacon object file that allows you to do some COM-based lateral movements. So getting away, they wanted to get away from all the PowerShell and some of these other more common techniques and use the Windows COM objects via some C code that they wrote and compiled as a beacon object file. So those are ways to extend it yourself. And this happens all the time. So many people create their own little tools and frameworks to do whatever it is they find there in their environment for lateral movement.
Yeah, and then COM. I mean, COM is older than I'm going to bet a significant number of the attendees to this stream. Yeah. Like that is some old school stuff that is still there. And the great thing about the old stuff is, I don't know, they don't go back and instrument that. It's there and you can't get rid of it. I mean,
there's and living off the land binaries. I know that there's a lot of list of these and a lot of these will execute code, but if you haven't ever looked, I look at all the time during an engagement, and I'm not going to name any, but there could be several video conferencing tools that have the ability to run arbitrary code. So there's files that exist, and if you can tell it, a certain parameter or give it a file, it will attempt to run that. So these are valid techniques for either local process execution or, even remote process execution. So all of these things are really interesting. And then when someone discovers these, you can write a script or something to help automate that through maybe aggressor script, or if you really want to get crazy, create your own beacon object file to roll your own C code.
Yeah, great point. There's a question here in the chat related to automation. Yes, we can script up when a beacon first checks in. We can actually have it take actions immediately upon checking in. So you might have it immediately migrate, like if you're trying to, jump into a browser through an exploit that you'd have to custom load, whatever. Immediately take some of those actions on target. Immediately try to extract some information back from those systems. I like to keep that pretty small because I don't want to have that too fingerprintable or too noisy to some degree.
Yeah, and all of that comes down to the aggressor script language is what you're writing this in. So to make decisions, and just to be honest, the current state of Cobalt Strike, some people argue that it's a operator driven tool. So the automation is as creative as the operators. Future pieces I'm working on right now are geared around providing a little bit more feedback from every single command so that you can wrap logic around that. But regardless of that, that logic will fall onto you as the operator to decide, what does this mean? Because context, and I know there's a lot of people who have AI, and maybe there's some more people who are much smarter than I am when it comes to AI, but I have found the best AI is your team. To actually put operational context around what's going on, besides saying I'm in medium integrity or high integrity. Those are simple things, but what I always talk about is those operators who generate their own luck. Like he's like, how did you figure this out? They just know how to see something shiny, and they know what that is, and they see it, so they're able to generate their own luck. And that is what this allows you to do, and you can do it manually. Or once you kind of figure out that state, you can say, okay, based on these conditions, I can jam out a really quick script. And, every time this happens, I can, take action on it.
Well, I think it's an interesting point too, that I think it's more to the point that, because you hear about automated red teams, right? And if you're trying to rerun the same task to test your defenders, sure, but putting the puzzle pieces together for puzzles that you've never seen, or pieces that has to be a human operation at some degree, right? So I have a huge problem with that, automated red team, because those are two very counter topics.
Yeah, that's a tough one to challenge. I'm not saying there's not a place for that.
Sure.
But the depth and the amount of simulate some sort of real attack. If you look at any threat report and see an attack, every single threat measures what happened on that day by that team, what happened. If this was repeated, those steps may not have occurred the same way based on the person behind the keyboard. So you really need to understand, this group doesn't do these things because that's what they do. They did it because the person behind the keyboard said, this is what I'm going to do. A lot of times we overthink capabilities on these things, but you need to understand and control your artifacts about what you're working on. And that's really what you're trying to do, is to drive that.
Yeah. And related to the artifacts thing, sometimes we want to be super quiet, or start off quiet and then amp up the noise. Jeff McJunkin, the national treasure, Jeff McJunkin, commented that, hey, sometimes I like to just, on every system I'm on, put a file. His example was C:/Red Siege was here, just to say, yeah, I planted a flag here. And did you get telemetry with this? And that should be part of the follow-up if you're doing something on the redder end of the spectrum, is to have a feedback loop. Not just, hey, you were owned, chuck a report over the wall, but hey, here's the exact times. The great thing with Cobalt Strike is we can extract logs and say, here's the exact time I took this action on target, and then compare that to logging and alerting and saying what was missed, what actually worked. Was this alerting but no one followed up? What was the process failure? Because it always comes down to a process failure.
Yeah, I do want to comment on something Jeff is putting out there, and I'm glad he puts that out there, because this is what I always see. When you look at security operations, ultimately we're trying to measure security operations. I put it into 3 pillars: into prevention, detection, and response. We can go in more depth, but that's usually what you're looking for. And Jeff puts it out there really, really well. Pen test your prevention controls, unit detect your detection controls, and then red team your responses. So in other words, that's really where you're trying to push this. So comprehensively, you need that's why I always call it a threat-based security testing plan or program. And I'm not going to go into the whole red teaming and such, because to be honest, I'm not as much of a fan of red teaming as I once was. It comes with some baggage that is misunderstood. So I just say we need a threat-based approach to do exactly what Jeff said. We need to look at prevention, detection, and response. And yes, I do agree that unit testing detection controls is a great way of becoming efficient. So you can say, here's my detection controls. I have these standards, these detection assumptions. I can measure those, and I can measure those over time. So those are some values on repeating and doing more of an atomic level test. I would say Cobalt Strike was not designed to be an atomic level test component. Again, it's a framework to go in depth to really measure all of those things, minus the automation.
Yeah, a tool like Scythe is very much designed for that. Someone sets up the test, and the defenders can run through it over and over and over again and say, hey, here's the action that was taken. Can it detect it? No. Okay, let's tweak. Let's take that exact same action again and again and again, where I'm going to stress that specific detection capability, logging, whatever, alerting, and say, can I tune to find and operate with that? It's not something you really want to do with Cobalt Strike. It's meant much more to be, operator driven. Yeah. So I think,
yes.
and I think, yeah, cool. Anything else, Joe?
No, I'm just going to kind of follow along and see when we get to the Q&A and see what we can get to.
There was a question here real quick, so I wanted to address. There was any resources on writing your own stage 0 loader. This is a very dynamic area, because of the fluidity of EDR and AV. Mike Saunders on my team wrote a AV bypass blog post a month ago. I forget when it was. Jaycon, if you can throw that up on the screen. If you want to check that out, it talks through some of the process for tweaking the executable so that you might bypass the AV. How can you identify what's going on? But that is a very laborious process. It's not something you want to just, hey, let me try that out today. No, this takes some time, and then you're gonna get burned, and you're gonna try again and again and again, and sometimes you don't know what the pieces are that's getting caught, so it's just a ton of trying, and it's a lot of failure along the way. All right, with that, let's jump into some of our C2 design. This is a little bit more related to kind of at a higher level. How are we gonna set this whole thing up? We talked about this a little bit earlier. We're gonna have multiple tiers. So we've got our interactive. So I'm interacting on a system. This could be every 1 minute. It could be a little bit faster. I could go every 5 seconds. If I really need to go fast, just hit this thing as fast as possible. What we want here is different profiles at the different tiers. So that, for example, if my interactive tier here, if that's burned, I don't lose everything. Like, oh, we see this action taken on this target. It's going to this particular domain. Let's burn that domain and identify every system that has ever talked to that domain. So we'll have multiple profiles here. So we might have our interactive tier, again, could be every 5 seconds. I like 1 to 5 minutes-ish. Our short haul, the next tiers kind of depend on how long is the operation going to last. Joe and I have done some work together, and I think we had 3 or 4 days. We would make this one maybe once an hour in a situation like that. If you've got a longer one, it might be once a day where it checks in for tasking. Then you'll have your long haul, which is even lower, even slower. It could be once every 8 hours, once every day or few days even. And you'll use the higher ones to reconstruct the lower ones should they be burned. Of course, you'll have to build new profiles along the way. And we want to change our Malleable C2. We talked about that to some degree a little bit earlier, right? So this is a big thing in the red side is OPSEC, right? I want to not give away my actions on the target. Also, I want to protect myself. So what I want to do is I want to key my executables so that, hey, if I send a phishing payload in, for example, and someone decides to forward it to home, it says, you know what, you're not in the domain, so we're not going to execute. One, it means analysis is going to be a little bit more difficult. It also means that we stay in scope. We can fingerprint the system a little bit. What other things do we know to be true about a real live system in the environment versus some sort of sandbox technology? We've got all sorts of different cloud fronting. There's the traditional classic domain fronting that is still useful, where we use known trusted certificates and essentially jump through those. That is largely, well, I should say largely dead. It's dying because we've seen Google and Amazon are taking actions to prevent that. We can still, I think it's Fastly, someone correct me if I'm wrong, things like that still work. I expect that will die relatively quickly, but there are other ways to do this with HTTP proxies through some of these systems, things like AWS Lambda. So we can jump through legitimate AWS services with our Lambda. We build something, take an action, and immediately tear it down. We might be able to jump through some of that. Domain selection, we've got some options here. Again, cloud fronting in some way, shape, or form, fantastic. They are trusted domains. Everybody lets Amazon in the door. If we need to build our own custom domain, one of the things that I like to do is use expired domains. They've already been categorized, right? I mentioned this a little bit before. Medical and banking. Some organizations will not inspect traffic to medical sites or personal banking sites because it has potential to put them at risk. Alternatively, you can do some of your own shepherding where you buy a fresh domain, you let it cook, let it get categorized, put up a fake website to get it into the categorization with all the various tools like Blue Coat, whatever, and then maybe try to fall under medical or banking in some way, shape, or form here. Various C2 methods, we mentioned this a little bit before. HTTP, HTTPS, very common. DNS, similar to PowerShell, best friend or worst enemy. If no one's looking, this is phenomenal. If anyone's looking, it is exceptionally loud. None of your systems should be making this many DNS requests to the same domain in that short period of time. There's other custom C2 we've got available. We can do something like C3. Check out some of the other links here as well. We also have SMB. We're going to use this to communicate between systems inside the network. Let me jump over here. Then we'll come back. So I'll have inside the network two systems communicating with each other over a named pipe using SMB. 445 allowed all over inside the organizations. It is the protocol of Microsoft and Windows. Use this to communicate, and we have one system then doing the backhaul. So it's one system connecting back to our system, to our team server, not all of the compromised hosts there. Joe, questions and comments on C2 design? I know you spent a lot of time when you developed your course and when you wrote your book. Comments on?
No, it goes down to one, controlling your infrastructure. So controlling your team server. I don't ever recommend having a team server not being fronted by a redirector of some sort. So my go-to that I use, and I did post something, and I think Justin will be sending it out. Black Hills did a blog post on CloudFront redirection. So you called it cloud redirectors, and I like that term better because then domain fronting or something, or cloud fronting, because you're really saying let's use cloud services to do things, and most of these cloud services have some sort of HTTP proxy, and that is my go-to modern version of domain fronting. Domain fronting is the traditional domain fronting is becoming harder. It's not impossible; it's just harder. But looking at things front, or Google has their own, Azure has their own. They basically have HTTP proxies, and you just not much different than setting up like an Apache proxy server or an Nginx proxy server. You just set up a cloud version. And right now, my standard build that I use if I want to spin up a Cobalt Strike instance for testing in real world spins up an AWS CloudFront redirector, an Apache redirector that goes to my protected team server. It's all fully automated. It gets the domain for me. It sets up the listeners for me. I literally in 5 minutes have a fully functioning domain with SSL to the real cloud servers. It's all ready to go. I don't build anything. So I pre-planned everything. I hit a button and it spins up my test infrastructure so that I have a real world on the internet's range to do some testing with. And that's my go-to right now.
Cool. All right. Last little bits here coming up. So there's a lot of built-in capabilities here to Cobalt Strike. One of the sort of notable exceptions, and I don't mean this in a bad way, it's not what it's designed to do, is some of the exploit capabilities, right? That's sort of our stage 0 to some degree. We mentioned a number of these. There's different ways to inject shellcode into memory to execute, ways to run executables. Other kind of fun ones are block DLLs. So you're like, hey, this is my process. Nobody else can inject into here. Maybe keep some of the AV out. Always interesting stuff. Transfer files to and from the system. Be careful with that. Don't be the breach. Don't pull the sensitive data back if you don't need that. Good old keylogger. I love me some keylogger. This was the cool thing to do prior to Mimikatz. Mimikatz allows us to get clear text credentials from RAM. There are some mitigations, protections surrounding that. But the keylogger, that is how the user enters credentials into terminal websites, whatever. Grab that. All sorts of great stuff. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on all this because this is much easier to read in the documentation. Let's jump real quick into some of the detections here. Now, the detections are a little bit more difficult to a degree, okay? Now, detecting the tool, we talked about this up front. We really want to change our system, change our techniques, our tooling so that the tool isn't caught, because the defenders are catching the pen testers. Well, that's great. What's going to happen when the intruder comes in? Now, there's some great ways to catch Cobalt Strike itself. Actually, there's one great way that I've ever heard of. JA3. Now, some of you are like, what the hell is a JA3? What JA3 does is it fingerprints the connection, the client, as well as the server, and fingerprints it based on the SSL versions it supports, the ciphers, etc., and then grabs a hash of that and uses that hash to identify the connection out, the client going out, or the server. So the JA3 calculation looks like this. I'm not going to go over through the super details, but we take all these various pieces, comma separate them, hash it, and we get a result. Here is the hashes for JA3 for Cobalt Strike on Windows 10 to a Kali system, or, for example, Metasploit. We actually got busted by this last year with an Apex Defender. Honestly, I didn't even know much about it at the time, but what they did is they fingerprinted JA3, the client connecting out. There is currently no way to change that. I can much more easily change the fingerprint of the server, but it's significantly harder. You would have to do something custom to modify the fingerprint of the client connecting out. So great technique here. Now, this is the piece. Joe and I talked about this over and over and over again. Stop trying to detect the tool. Now, the JA3, that is part of your toolkit. That's great. What you want to do is detect the techniques, right? A password spray is a password spray is a password spray. Are you detecting that on the inside? Are you detecting lateral movement? Are you detecting, hey, why is Powershell being run by someone in marketing, right? So there's a great blog post here. It's Defender's Guide to Cobalt Strike. I like to call it the Defender's Guide. Yes, there's a lot of Cobalt Strike in here, but there are so many actions that every adversary takes on target, regardless of Cobalt Strike, that we should be able to detect, respond, and get alerted to. Right? Mike Saunders on my team has a blog post, Threading the Needles, Why Defense in Depth Still Matters. That is so stinking important here. Don't just focus on, how do I stop Cobalt Strike? No. Take a step back. How do I stop the attackers? How am I stopping? And most of the time, if you read the breach reports, the attackers aren't getting super high tech. It is the basics, and we are winning time and time again, or I guess losing time and time again to the basics. Joe, any comments, thoughts as we wrap things up?
No. The focusing on tool is important. Again, it goes back to if you haven't looked into detection strategies, which I feel is the opposite end of what we do from the threat emulation side or threat-based testing side. We're ultimately trying to measure some sort of detection strategies, and these strategies can be narrow, which would I say is signature focused, which is detecting the tool, versus wide, versus detecting the actual techniques that are involved. And the reason I say this is important because the big dichotomy I see in the whole defensive side of things is we either feel like we can patch our way to security or we can apply some appliance to do all the security things. And if any work with any professional security tester, the things they do to dance around, to get around security controls are sometimes very, very simple. And it's not because they're the smartest and the defenses are not. It's defenders are often misunderstanding the right approach. So the same kind of approach that people take from the attack side, we need to make sure our defenders are thinking and applying those same critical thought processes to their defensive strategies. And tool focused, you typically lose more than you win. Can you cut out the noise? 100%. Would I say get rid of tool-based approaches and signatures? Not at all. Those are cut down the noise to minimize the impact and of your actual analysts that are working, so you can focus on the real things.
Yeah, there's a great quote here from Jeff. Attackers behave fundamentally different than your employees. Key in on those differences, and you'll find attackers and those interesting exceptions, regardless of their tools and techniques. That's so spot on. Thank you once again, National Treasure Jeff McJunkin. All right, let's jump into the questions. By the way, Jeff pointed out I did misspeak a little bit earlier. JA3 is for fingerprinting the client. JA3S is for the server. Sorry. Cool. Yeah. All right, as we get into the questions here, real quick, let me. If you want to contact us, we do all sorts of the offensive things. Contact at redsiege.com. Email me personally, Tim at redsiege.com. Hit us up on the Twitters, Facebooks, things like that. But questions right now. Any questions from folks? What do we got?
I did see one earlier while we're waiting, and I don't mind jumping into it because it's part of the news of the day, and I guess I'm going to touch that.
Go for it.
Vermilion Strike, so the new Linux agent, and it's like seems to be a big deal in the news. So I look at this as, oh, okay, so someone created a client for a known server. And I say that I don't consider it a big deal. I mean, is it something that a company like Help Systems would want? Of course not. But from a technical perspective, decomposing a server and then building a client onto it, it seems very, very reasonable. I'd argue that many people in the testing community have done that to some degree in order to test and measure some sort of server. So it's standard kind of a process. So seeing that someone has done that is not a big deal. And it's not the first time it's happened. There's been other times that this has been done to where people have created clients. And I saw something kind of tongue in cheek. Well, you could do it for a long time using Wine under Linux. So you can type wine beacon.exe, but I know that's a little silly, but still, I guess my point is there's ways, if you understand the communications and you can communicate to a server, you can talk to it. So that is not surprising to me. What's surprising to me is the time and effort that people spend to build that on top of the framework that exists. I'm like, wow, that's a lot of effort to when you could just go take any other framework that's a little bit more open and available.
Well, it's funny because I saw, related to that, I saw someone posting, it's like, well, it bypasses all the AV on Linux. No one runs AV on Linux anything. So that's going to that's a little bit of sarcasm, but I guess mostly not. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see that. No, I agree. And when I see those statements, to be honest, it actually worries me more for the security industry as a whole that we say, oh no, it bypassed our AV. AV is not this. AV is you must be this tall to ride. Like that's where it should be. It's the minimal bar. I got a D and a D was passing. I did good, like I did good in school, like that's what it was. And that's not that it's bad, but you need to have that minimal bar, but you can't make that a maximum. And so often we make these minimums maximums in the security, in the overall security framework that we have.
And we got to look for the
rough.
dumb stuff first, right? Trying to go back and install AV in your Linux systems, that's not the biggest risk. Anyway, J-Con, what do we got for questions here?
Fubar is asking, I've seen people spin up on a team server open to the world and get a bunch of decoy beacons. I haven't seen this addressed anywhere. What's the intention with these?
I mean, I think...
So I'll answer all those crazy questions. So unless you wanted to take it, Tim.
I mean, are they actually getting beacons, or is somebody just...
So it's calm. So this is
the port. It says beacon, but it doesn't actually...
Yeah. So again, this is if you can communicate to a server, you can make communications to that. So if you have, well, there's two pieces to that. One, there's having open Cobalt Strike listener to the internet, and there's having port 50,050 to the internet. Those are quite different things. One is for the administration side of Cobalt Strike, for the client to communicate. One is actually for your beacon to talk to. In the case that I'm thinking, I'm reading this as if you have fake beacon saying a listener is open, typically those listeners enable staging. So the standard Metasploit stager that's been around forever, which is the core stager for Cobalt Strike. Again, I don't recommend using that. If you can do this, you can stage a fake stage, pull down the configuration, gather that configuration information, and then make some fake beacon requests. That's in essence what they're doing. A lot of threat intel companies, this is how they actually scan the internets for Cobalt Strike. They're really looking for these default kind of poorly set up servers that are out there. I often don't find more professional testers falling to this. Not that it doesn't happen, but it does. But this is really what's going on. So again, it all comes down to, if I understand how to communicate to a server, I can, to some degree, start that communication.
I don't know if you addressed this, but Mr. Bertoni has anybody ever tested Azure domain fronting last time? Has anybody tested Azure domain fronting last time? Does that make sense to anybody?
Azure is basically dead for fronting. Okay.
Yeah, I have not looked, so I don't have a good comment on that one, unfortunately.
Over in the YouTube, I'm extremely late, but are any engagements Cobalt? What is this question? What is it like nowadays professionally for red teams, or is it much more customized?
So I would argue really what you're looking at is engagements should be tailored to the level of defenses that you have. In other words, whether they're explicitly stated or not stated, there is a detection strategy of some sort. Some people to say our strategy is we bought some tools and we have some people watching alerts. And some actually spend time to actually create dedicated strategies to extract telemetry to understand certain conditions, so that you look at, like, I use MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK it's just a big grid. So you can have these columns and have like walls, or you can have like minefield of detections. And if you can start to fill that minefield in, I may not detect you on your first two steps, but I might get you on your third step. So I would say the level of effort and customization is high in well-defended environments. A lot of if you go over to, if you follow us on Bloodhound Gang and the Aggressor channel and Slack, there's a lot of discussions, or the Red Team channel. There's a lot of really in-depth discussions that go from like basic, like how do I do this in PowerShell, to I've got to do some serious memory bypassing and hooking into various, like the IAT of a process to make sure I can change the way things work.
Our very own Mike was saying that you mentioned lessening opinion on red teaming. Would like to hear your thoughts.
Lessening. Oh, yeah. So, okay. Red teaming. Yeah. So red teaming, if I asked everyone a poll, what does red teaming mean? We're not going to have a single statement. We're going to have advanced pen testing. We're going to say it's got to be covert, all these things. And that argument drives me nuts in our own industry with our own peers. So I still use the term, but I take a step back, and not just this term, everything I've learned as a consultant and working with organizations from highly technical to leadership is we've got to come to a common foundation and have a common lexicon of knowledge or definitions before we can get started. So when I look at red teaming, we've got to define that. And I have typically taken a step back and say, let's not work at red teaming. Let's look at where your goals are first, and we'll back into what you're trying to do. I put that entire thing under threat-based testing. And I say, we're going to start with this threat-based testing thing to not have any preconceived ideas about what we should be doing. It's got to be covert. We can't tell anybody, because as soon as you start to limit yourself in those areas, then you're going to say, well, we can't do an assumed breach, or you're going to have to prove that you can hack me through phishing. And you put all these limitations in there. So let's take a step back, understand your goals, and then we can put it into a category. But I always start off with threat-based testing first, because ultimately what we're trying to do is measure our defenses, prevention, detection, response from threats, people, the tools, the intentions, all of those things that we're trying to understand.
Yeah, and I try to, like, to Joe's point, when someone calls us and like, we want a red team, I'm like, why? What? Let's back up. What are you trying to get to? And in a significant portion of the time, it's, well, the CISO heard about red teaming and we want a red team. Like, oh, okay, so what are your goals? To not piss off the CISO. Okay, great. Well,
Yeah.
Let's talk about your organizational goals. What are you trying to actually accomplish? And 9 times out of 10, red teaming isn't necessarily the best fit. And I mean that because I hate to overly generalize that. The goal is to test the detection and response capabilities of the defenders, right? And with a traditional red team, we spend a ton of time with that initial access. The phish and the recon and all that takes weeks of some very expensive people's time. I much prefer, and I know Joe does because we talked about this, a much more assumed breach approach. So Mike Saunders and I have both done some talks related to the assumed breach. But with the assumed breach, we can do an assumed breach assessment, but do it on the red end of the spectrum. So we say, look, let's start on a system on the inside, right? Because according to the Verizon breach report, how are the bad guys getting in? They're getting in through phishing, they're getting in through lost, stolen credentials, and they're getting in through a rogue insider. In all of those cases, essentially, the attacker is starting in the network. Let's fast forward to when that thing happens and save the time up front and be much more efficient and save money for things that matter more than let's track down this stupid bloody phish. Give us access to that first system, and then let's play the red team game.
Yep. I do see a comment here, kind of on that note. It says most companies are not ready for red teaming. I actually don't agree with that, because red team, again, you've already decided what it means. So I'd say all companies are ready for threat-based testing, because education, I can't tell you how many times I've done a red team, very open. I won't call it purple teaming, but very much we're going to walk through this baby steps, knowing that my attacks are going to be highly successful. But that wasn't the point to say what you could stop me. But the point was to show to provide that organization what a real assessment on a live production network looks like. So you can say, here's the areas that they did. Here's the gaps that we have. This is what we're looking at. Most of their fixes might be preventative in nature. We might be doing this, but I actually argue that there is room for red teaming, or what I'd say threat-based testings, for pretty much any organization. And that might mean like it might be a consulting gig to actually like, let's talk about what you have, you know?
Yeah, I think the key differentiator, to make this as simple, this of course is a much longer conversation. The simple difference is between a pen test and a red team is a pen test tests your defenses, and a red team to test your defenders. Do you want to bring your defenders into the mix or not? If so, we can talk about some sort of red style approach. I like Stacy's comment here. The assumed breach plus adversary emulation for the win. Could not agree with you more. There was a question up above related to loading multiple profiles on a single team server. I don't think there's a way to do that, Joe.
You can use variants to get, and the attributes under the Cobalt Strike variants are limited to primarily the comms area. This is actually something we're looking at changing around. My answer to that, and this is what I've done for years, is I create a team server per look and feel that I want. So I have no problem doing multiple team servers. So I say this team server is associated with this payload, which has these characteristics. Not everyone wants to do that, and they just want it all together. It's been a preference of mine to segregate and create payloads which are tied to listeners and the C2 channels to map to my command and control plan. So that's typically how I handle that. But from an actual technical perspective, you can use variants, but again, variants primarily focus around the HTTP comms.
So the question here from JW was, when Cobalt Strike was flagged with JA3, was it done via PCAP or interface monitoring? They were monitoring their outbound traffic and just caught it immediately. It was a very well done job by those folks. Question here from Darth Homie. I've never used Cobalt Strike before. Would it be suitable for your normal pen test engagements compared to Metasploit? Yes. Frankly, we rarely use Metasploit unless I need an exploit that's specifically in Metasploit. Our go-to is Cobalt Strike. It's just because in a lot of organizations, the traditional exploits, they're just not available.
Yeah.
Now, if we need it, that's a completely different story. But Cobalt Strike, that is definitely our go-to here. That's personal experience here.
Yeah.
Personal
On that, again, and I like the multiplayer aspect of that. It allows for multiple people to use it, and if you set it up in a good way, you can actually have multiplayer where everyone can share the same screens. That gets into effective command and control infrastructure design, which is really, really good to shadow everyone as you're clicking through the mouses and everything to show things. But then you get into, if you need an exploit, sometimes people create these as an add-on for Cobalt Strike, or you get something like, shameless plug, Core Impact or Metasploit, or something that actually contains the exploits themselves. And then you can bounce back and forth between the products to stage a beacon, if you will. But most time, exploits are a means to an end. You run it once and you're done. You don't need to exploit over and over and over and over. You're really just trying to laterally move or privilege escalator. You're trying to gain one more step in, and then that's over. And then you move on.
The big game changer, if you will, because it was that everyone used Metasploit before, but the multiplayer aspect is significantly lacking. It was kind of a bolt-on afterwards. It's kind of clunky. The multiplayer aspect is a big difference with things like Cobalt Strike. If you want to check out the C2 Matrix, there's other ones that are out there. There's other free. There's other 4 paid products on the C2 Matrix. Jay kind of pushed the link here in a second. There's a big list of those various ones you can select. Hey, I want DNS, I want multiplayer, I want these other things, and you can pick and choose and find the framework that works for you. The reason that Cobalt Strike is an industry standard to some degree is those beacons they just bloody work. I can't tell how many times I've had like a PowerShell Empire, for example, maybe Agent, especially years ago, where I just lost it. Like I fought really hard to get that, and it just died. And I'm like, well, crap. Now I have to fight to get back in.
Yeah, I joined the team. I've been with the team now for 6 months. I've been a user and actually a practitioner of in the red teaming space and stuff since it started. I actually, in my old days working in the government, I actually brought Cobalt Strike over, helped bring that over to our team as we shifted some frameworks around. I wrote my own, which is, I don't recommend writing your own C2 framework, which is funny because now I work on a team who does that, but it's a pain in the butt, just to be honest. But so what I've always loved about Cobalt Strike, and you could slap me for have a sales hat, but stability. Like that's my number one thing that I've liked, is not because it has all the greatest post-exploitation, because there's a lot of tools and things out there that do better. But as far as rock solid, and you leave for the weekend and you come back and everything's still working, that is amazing. That is just because it's hard enough to be an operator because you're doing everything through a straw. That's what I say. You're hacking all the things. You don't get a full console. You don't get everything. You're hacking through the straw. So everything is hard. So having a framework that's stable and reliable is what I like the most. Yeah, I will answer another question in there too, I saw.
Yeah, well, my if I did pick 2 things that I need from a C2, it's going to be multiplayer and stability.
Yeah.
That's the first 2 things. Everything else is secondary.
Yeah, we get, people that say, well, it is detected here, it's done this or this, and it's like, yeah, that's true. And then that's why it's framework, so you can extend, and like beacon object files, you can roll your own things, but those run inside your own beacon context. So it's like, it's up to you to make sure you don't break your beacon. So there's pros and cons to doing that. I did see a question in here. I'll answer. It says, would it be possible to buy CS from a non-US from non-US someday? Right now, Cobalt Strike is sold worldwide, so it's not a matter of where you can buy it or not. The process of purchasing Cobalt Strike is very restrictive due to U.S. laws and some internal processes. Obviously, Cobalt Strike is abused, and we try to minimize that. So I would say it's actually really, really restrictive to purchase, to the point where a lot of people actually get mad at us and say that we're not being fair or something. But there are legitimate companies who get caught in the net of being denied a licenses. And it's, I argue that that's part of our attempting to minimize doing our part on the side of Cobalt Strike. But yeah, it is possible. And we have a strict set of guidelines and stuff that we follow to sell the product. But it is regularly sold to established organizations who can follow the process.
See, we got anything. Darth Homie, is there any documentation on setting up a CS pen test environment?
A CS. Jeff Dimmick's Blues. He used to have
so
something.
there's tons of documentation. I think they're talking about,
tough.
hey, how can I set this up to test? There's a lot of documentation. It frankly, out the box, it's not that terribly hard. You run the team server where you want it to connect. You fire up the client on the user side. Click connect it to your team server. There is some great documentation on the Cobalt Strike website for how to set up.
Yeah, the training website. Raphael created, the original author of Cobalt Strike, created something a couple years ago. Maybe it was 2019. Regardless, it was like an 8 or 9 part series of introduction to Cobalt Strike. And he doesn't tell you how he built his range, but if you watch that, you can say, oh, I could probably build these targets and follow along. It goes from setting it up to the theory of red teaming and threat emulation to actually using all of the components. It is, I don't know, it's like 7 or 8 hours long. It's not the best, but it's specifically showing how Cobalt Strike can be used in an environment. Yeah.
All right, last questions before we wrap it up. And we went long. This is one of the longer SiegeCasts, but this is a lot of important information. So, all right, see, last questions. Anything else? No. Let me think. Is there anything? All right, so that is it for the SiegeCast. Cobalt Strike Basics. I want to thank you again, Joe Vest, for being here. We have next coming up, tomorrow, Tim?
So tomorrow we have our next Wednesday Offensive. We do Wednesday Offensive every Thursday, 1:30 Eastern Time, 12:30 Central, 11:30 Mountain, 10:30 Pacific. Half an hour. We are very strict on the half an hour. No slides, just talk. So it's very interactive. We have a guest, comes in with a topic, talks for 10, 15 minutes. Feel free to turn your cameras on, mics on. Ask questions. We don't have to go through the chat interface. It's a ton of fun. It's a much more sort of intimate conversation. I love that. Again, next up we have Moses Frost over at Grim on the Red Team operations side. Join us, redsiege.com/wedoff.